The crystal glass of water on the white tablecloth trembled, a tiny, silent earthquake caused by Jessica's shaking hand under the table. Across from her, Derek smiled. It was a thin, cold smile that never reached his eyes, a smile that made her skin feel like ice. He was cutting his steak, the knife scraping against the fine china with a sound that set her teeth on edge. "Is your food not to your liking, Jessica?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk but with a sharp edge underneath. "You've barely touched it." She forced a nod, her throat too tight to form words. The fancy restaurant, with its soft music and dim lights, felt like a beautiful cage. The other people laughing and talking were in a different world, a safe world. She was trapped in hers, a prisoner at a table for two. His hand, heavy and possessive, had been on her knee under the table for most of the evening, a constant, awful reminder of why she was here. She had tried to shift away, but his grip had only tightened, his fingers digging in like a warning. This was her life now. A life of quiet threats and forced smiles. But tonight, something inside her was screaming. She couldn't do this anymore. She wouldn't. Her fingers, hidden in her lap, found the stiff linen of the napkin. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a wild bird. This was her only chance. With Derek momentarily distracted, signaling a waiter for more wine, she acted. Her hand, clutching the pen she'd secretly pulled from her small purse, flew across the fabric. It was just 2 words, a desperate prayer which said, "Help me." She folded the napkin, her movements quick and jerky, placing it half under her plate, the message facing outward. It was a beacon, a signal flare in the dark sea of the restaurant. Now, she just had to get someone to see it. The waiter, a young man with a polite expression, approached to fill their wine glasses. This was it. Jessica's eyes locked onto him, pleading, screaming silently. She subtly nudged the napkin with her elbow, making it more visible. But the waiter's gaze was fixed on the task of pouring, a professional smile on his face. He finished, gave a slight bow, and turned away. He hadn't seen a thing. The hope that had flared in her chest extinguished, leaving her colder and more terrified than before. But someone else had seen. At a solitary table tucked into a shadowy corner, marked only by a small brass 13, a man had been watching. He moved with a stillness that was unnerving, a predator's patience. His name was Julian. While the restaurant saw a wealthy, handsome diner enjoying a quiet meal, the underworld knew him as a storm, a mafia boss whose word was law. His eyes, a piercing shade of stormy gray, missed nothing. They had been drifting over the room, a king surveying his kingdom, when they had snagged on the young woman with the frightened doe eyes and the man whose touch made her flinch. He had seen the forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. He had seen the way she held herself, so tense she might shatter. And he had seen, with perfect clarity, the frantic movement of her hand under the table, the secret scribble, the careful placement of the napkin. He saw the desperate hope in her eyes as she tried to catch the waiter's attention, and the crushing despair when she failed. A strange, unfamiliar feeling twisted in Julian's chest. It wasn't pity. Pity was for the weak. This was something else, something hotter and more possessive. A primal urge to protect what was clearly being mistreated. That man, Derek, was a bug, an annoyance who thought his money and his cruel smile made him powerful. Julian knew real power. And in that moment, he decided she would be under his protection. His gaze never left her as he gave a nearly imperceptible nod to a large man standing near the entrance. A plan, simple and efficient, was set into motion. A moment later, there was a tremendous crash from the other side of the restaurant. A busboy had, quite accidentally, dropped an entire tray of dirty dishes. The sound of shattering porcelain was deafening. Every head in the restaurant, including Derek's, snapped toward the noise, a chorus of gasps and murmurs filling the air. It was the only distraction Julian needed. While the world was looking away, he moved. He was a shadow, fluid and silent, crossing the space between his table and hers in a few long, purposeful strides. He didn't look at Derek. His entire focus was on her. Jessica was still staring at the commotion when a wave of heat and the faint, clean scent of sandalwood and spice washed over her. A large, powerful body was suddenly beside her chair. Her head whipped around, and her breath caught in her throat. It was the man from table 13. Up close, he was overwhelming. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained against the fine fabric of his dark suit. His jaw was strong, his features sharp and perfectly carved. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They weren't just gray, they were like molten silver, burning with an intensity that seared right through her. They saw everything, her fear, her shame, her secret. His arm brushed against her shoulder as he reached for her napkin. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her, so powerful it made her gasp. It wasn't the frightening touch of Derek. This was different. This was thrilling. In one smooth, impossibly fast motion, he palmed the napkin with her desperate message and let it vanish into his jacket pocket. At the exact same time, his other hand placed a fresh, neatly folded napkin squarely on her plate. His fingers, long and elegant, brushed against the back of her hand for a heartbeat too long. A touch that was both a promise and a command. Their eyes locked. The noise of the restaurant faded into a dull hum. The world shrank to just the two of them. In that single, breathless moment, he wasn't just a stranger. He was an answer. "Look at the note when you are alone," he murmured, his voice a deep, low rumble that vibrated right down to her bones. It was a voice used to being obeyed. And then he was gone, melting back into the shadows of the restaurant as if he were a ghost. Her heart was no longer just racing from fear. It was pounding with a wild, chaotic mix of terror and a strange, dizzying excitement. The spot on her hand where his fingers had touched felt branded, warm and tingling. She stared at the innocent-looking napkin on her plate, her mind reeling. Derek was still complaining loudly about the clumsiness of the staff, completely unaware that her entire world had just shifted on its axis. As soon as he was distracted again, looking away with a scowl, Jessica's trembling fingers unfolded the new napkin. The handwriting was bold, sharp, and confident, just like the man himself. "The garden. 5 minutes. I can keep you safe." The word echoed in her mind, a lifeline thrown into her stormy sea. But it was the memory of his eyes, the heat of his touch, and the deep, commanding rumble of his voice that truly convinced her. This was dangerous. He was dangerous. But the danger he offered was a fiery escape from the cold, slow death Derek promised. She didn't know if she could trust him. She didn't know who he was. But as she sat there, the new napkin clutched tightly in her fist, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was going to meet him. The French doors to the garden felt heavier than they looked, their cold brass handle a final barrier between the prison she was leaving and the terrifying unknown she was entering. Jessica pushed them open, the cool night air hitting her flushed face like a blessing. The garden was a world of shadows and silence, a stark contrast to the bright, noisy restaurant. Moonlight dripped through the leaves of ancient oak trees, painting silver patterns on the flagstone path. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, each beat screaming turn back, turn back, turn back. But she didn't. She walked deeper into the darkness, her evening shoes whispering against the stone. And then she saw him. He was leaning against a stone bench, half shrouded in shadow, a silhouette of immense power. He wasn't just waiting, he was inhabiting the space, a part of the night itself. As she approached, he straightened, and the sheer size of him made her breath hitch. In the restaurant, she had sensed his strength. Here, in the intimate dark, it was a physical force that pressed against her. "Jessica." He said her name, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement, a claiming. His voice, that low, gravelly rumble, wrapped around her in the cool air, making her feel strangely warm. She couldn't find her voice, so she just nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "You are safe now," he said, taking a slow step toward her. He didn't touch her, but his closeness was its own kind of touch. "Derek will never frighten you again. That is a promise." "How can you promise that?" The words tumbled out, a desperate whisper. "You don't know him. I am a man who solves problems," Julian interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was calm, final. "And your problem is now mine. It is already being handled." The way he said, "handled," sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a gentle word. It was a hard, definitive word that spoke of a world she only knew from scary movies and whispered stories. She should have been terrified of him, of what he was implying. But all she felt was a dizzying, overwhelming sense of relief. The crushing weight that had been on her chest for months suddenly lifted, leaving her lightheaded. "Who are you?" she breathed, finally looking up into his face. The moonlight carved out the sharp planes of his cheeks, the strong line of his jaw. His eyes were no longer molten silver, but dark, deep pools, absorbing the night and her along with it. "My name is Julian," he said. "For now, that is all you need to know. Come." He didn't offer his hand. He simply turned, expecting her to follow. And she did, without a second of hesitation. It felt as natural as breathing. He led her not back toward the restaurant, but to a private gate at the far end of the garden, where a sleek, black car idled silently. A man as large and imposing as the one from the restaurant held the door open. Julian placed a hand on the small of her back to guide her inside. The touch was brief, polite even, but it burned through the fabric of her dress, a brand of possession that made her knees feel weak. The car moved through the city like a phantom, silent and swift. They didn't speak. He sat beside her, a quiet, powerful presence, his gaze fixed on the city lights sliding past the window. Jessica watched him from the corner of her eye, studying the way his hands rested on his knees, strong, capable hands that had just plucked her from one life and were delivering her to another. The apartment was not what she expected. It wasn't a cold, hidden lair. It was high in a sleek building with floor-to-ceiling windows that showed the entire city glittering like a bed of jewels. It was spacious and beautifully furnished, but it felt empty. Like a hotel. A safe house. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice small in the vast, quiet space. "A place no one can find you," he replied, shrugging off his jacket and draping it over a chair. He moved to a sideboard and poured a glass of amber liquid into a crystal glass. "Would you like a drink? You've had a shock." She shook her head, still standing awkwardly by the door. He came toward her, holding out a glass of water instead. "Then drink this. You're pale." Their fingers brushed as she took the glass, and again, that same electric current jolted up her arm. This time, he didn't pull away immediately. His eyes held hers, and in their dark depths, she saw something shift. The ruthless protector was still there, but now there was a flicker of something else. Curiosity. Interest. "You were very brave tonight," he said, his voice softer now. "It takes a strong spirit to cry for help when you are surrounded by wolves." "I didn't feel brave," she whispered, taking a sip of the water. "I felt desperate." "Bravery isn't the absence of fear, Jessica. It is acting despite it." He gestured toward a large, plush sofa. "Sit here and tell me." And so she did. She sat in the circle of soft lamplight, and the whole story poured out of her. How Derek had initially been charming, how he had slowly isolated her from her friends, the subtle threats that became less subtle, the way he saw her not as a person, but as a beautiful object he owned. Julian listened, never interrupting, his intense focus entirely on her. He didn't offer empty comforts. He just absorbed her pain. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "A man who preys on the kindness and fear of a woman is no man at all," he said, his voice like cold steel. "He is a coward. And I have no tolerance for cowards." In that moment, she saw past the suit, past the power, past the dangerous reputation. She saw a code. A fierce, unshakable sense of honor. He was a dangerous man, yes, but his danger had a purpose, a direction. It was a shield, not just a sword. "You are not what I expected," she said softly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "And what did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone crueler." "Perhaps I am," he replied, his gaze dropping to her mouth for a heartbeat before returning to her eyes. "But not with you. Never with you." He stood and came to sit beside her on the sofa, the space between them shrinking, filling with a new, charged energy. The air grew thick and warm. He reached out, and with a tenderness that belied his strength, he traced the path of a tear she hadn't even realized had escaped. His touch was electric. It was a gentle shock that spread from her cheek throughout her entire body, settling deep in her stomach as a warm, pooling heat. She didn't pull away. She leaned into it, her eyes fluttering closed for a second. "You have a fighter's spirit," he murmured, his thumb stroking her skin. "I saw it the moment I looked at you. A beautiful, caged bird, ready to break the bars." His face was so close now she could feel his warm breath on her skin. The scent of him, sandalwood and pure, clean male, was intoxicating. This was the thrilling, scary feeling. This was the danger. But it was a danger she wanted to drown in. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. He simply looked at her, his eyes saying everything his words did not. In that look, she saw a promise not just of safety, but of something more. Something passionate and consuming. A spark had been lit in the shadowy garden, and here, in the quiet safety of his sanctuary, it was bursting into flame. He leaned in, his lips hovering just a breath from hers. The world stopped. "Your old life is over, Jessica," he whispered, the words a vow against her skin. "It belongs to me now." The safe apartment, once a sterile hiding place, began to breathe. It started with small things. A book Jessica was reading left on the armrest of a chair. A soft, cream-colored sweater draped over the back of the sofa. The faint, sweet scent of her perfume that slowly chased away the smell of loneliness. Julian would come home, and it was a home now, not a fortress, and his eyes would immediately seek her out, finding a strange, new peace in her simple presence. Derek was gone. Julian had told her this one evening with a finality that left no room for questions. He'd simply said, "He will not be a part of your story anymore," and she had believed him completely. The fear that had been a constant, cold companion for so long simply melted away. In its place was a different, thrilling kind of heat. It began with touches. Not the accidental brushes of before, but deliberate, searching connections. His hand would find the small of her back as he passed her in the hallway, the pressure firm and possessive, sending a wave of warmth through her. She would reach out to straighten his tie before he left, her fingers lingering against the solid wall of his chest, feeling the powerful, steady beat of his heart. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, a magnetic pull that grew stronger with every passing day. One afternoon, a sudden summer storm rolled over the city. The sky darkened to a deep purple, and rain lashed against the huge windows, blurring the world outside into a watercolor painting. They stood together, watching the tempest. The raw power of it seemed to break the last of the barriers between them. Julian turned from the window to look at her, his stormy eyes reflecting the lightning outside. "You are not afraid of the storm?" he asked. "No," Jessica whispered, her gaze locked on his. "Not with you." That was all it took. He closed the distance between them in one swift movement, his hand coming up to cradle her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. His eyes searched hers for a final moment of permission, and then his mouth was on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a claiming, a release, a storm of its own. It was everything she had imagined and more, passionate, desperate, and deeply tender all at once. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against his hard body, and she melted into him, her hands sliding up to tangle in the dark hair at the nape of his neck. The world outside, the rain, the thunder, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only his taste, his scent, the overwhelming feel of him. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, a silent vow spoken from his soul to hers. From that moment, their relationship deepened, becoming more physical, more intimate. Their conversations by the window lasted long into the night, but now they were punctuated by long, slow kisses and the comfort of being wrapped in each other's arms. He learned the landscape of her body with a reverence that took her breath away, his tough, calloused hands impossibly gentle on her skin. She, in turn, learned the stories written on his, the faint scars, the powerful muscles, the hidden softness he showed only to her. He was not just her savior, he was her teacher in passion, and she was his sanctuary. In her arms, the hard, lonely man he had been began to soften. The constant tension in his shoulders eased. He started to smile, a real, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. She brought music into his silent apartment, laughter into his serious world, and a light so bright it chased the shadows from the corners of his soul. One evening, a few months later, he took her to a quiet, secluded villa by the sea. After a dinner under the stars, he led her down to the water's edge. The moon painted a silver path across the dark ocean. "I lived my life in the shadows," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. He held both of her hands in his. "I thought that was my destiny. To be alone. To be hard. And then I saw a frightened girl with the heart of a lion, writing a message only I was meant to see." He dropped to one knee and her heart stopped. From his pocket he drew a small, black velvet box. "You didn't just need saving, Jessica. You were sent to save me. You're my peace. You are my forever." He opened the box. Nestled inside was a breathtaking diamond that caught the moonlight and scattered it into 1,000 brilliant stars. "Marry me," he said, his eyes shining with a love so fierce it made her tremble. "Be my wife. Let me spend the rest of my life honoring the brave woman who wrote, 'Help me,' and ended up being the answer to my every prayer." Tears of pure joy streamed down her face as she nodded, her voice a choked sob of happiness. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, Julian. Always." He slid the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into an embrace that felt like coming home. The kiss they shared was a seal on their future, a promise of a love that would not just endure, but thrive. 5 years later, the sound of happy, childish laughter echoed through the sun-drenched garden of their permanent home. Jessica sat on a blanket, watching as Julian, his suit jacket long discarded, chased a dark-haired little boy with his mother's brave eyes. Their son. Julian swept the giggling toddler into his arms, blowing a raspberry on his cheek before carrying him back to Jessica. He sank down beside her, his arm immediately wrapping around her shoulders, pulling her close. He dropped a soft, lingering kiss on her lips, a simple, everyday gesture that still made her heart flutter. He looked at his son, then at his wife, his gaze full of a wonder that would never fade. "I have everything," he murmured, his voice filled with a peace that was once foreign to him. Jessica leaned her head on his shoulder, looking at the napkin she had framed and kept on her bedside table. A simple white linen square with 2 words that had changed everything. It was not a reminder of fear, but of the moment her courage led her to her destiny. The desperate note had become an unbreakable promise of love, loyalty, and a life spent together, forever. This is where their story ends, but ours doesn't have to. If your heart is still racing from Julian and Jessica's epic romance, do us a huge favor. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale of dangerous love and happy endings. We love hearing from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you thought about Julian and Jessica's journey. Did you cheer when he first saw the note? Did you swoon at the proposal? Share your thoughts. The crisp autumn air bit at Juliana's cheeks, but the chill she felt came from deep within. A single, perfect white rose trembled in her gloved hand, its petals a stark contrast to the gloomy gray of the cemetery. A year. It had been a year today since the world lost all its color, since the kindest man she'd ever known, her father, was taken from her. He'd been her anchor, a simple, loving bookshop owner whose biggest adventure was finding a rare first edition. This weekly visit to his grave was her pilgrimage, a quiet conversation with a memory. She trudged up the familiar path, her boots crunching on the gravel, the sound unnaturally loud in the sacred silence. But as she rounded the bend that led to her father's plot, her feet froze to the ground. The rose nearly slipped from her fingers. There, arrayed before the simple headstone that read, "Beloved Father," was a sight that stole the breath from her lungs. 10 men. 10 statuesque figures, clad in identical, impeccably tailored black suits, knelt in a perfect, unwavering line. They were so still they seemed carved from the shadows themselves, their heads bowed, their backs straight. Not a whisper passed between them. The air grew thick, heavy with a silence that was more than just quiet. It was a presence. It was power. Fear, cold and sharp, prickled at the back of her neck. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Who were these strangers, and what were they doing at her father's resting place? This man who loved crossword puzzles and old jazz records? It made no sense. Then movement. The man at the center of the line, the one directly before the headstone, uncoiled himself with a fluid, predatory grace that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. He rose to his full, imposing height, and as he turned, Juliana's breath hitched. He was arresting. Not merely handsome, but something more. His face was all sharp, elegant lines, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble high cheekbones, and a mouth set in a firm, unsmiling line. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a shade of stormy gray, and in their depths swirled an ancient seriousness, a weight that seemed far too heavy for his age, which she guessed to be mid-30s. He began to walk toward her, his steps slow and deliberate, each one echoing the frantic beat of her heart. The 9 other men remained kneeling, a human wall of unwavering loyalty. Juliana found herself rooted to the spot, a mixture of fear and a strange, defiant protectiveness for her father's space keeping her there. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could smell the faint, clean scent of sandalwood and rain on his wool coat. He was taller than she'd realized, and she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his gaze. The intensity in those gray eyes was almost a physical touch. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice a shaky whisper that was carried away by the wind. "Why are you at my father's grave?" His gaze swept over her face, taking in her wide, fearful eyes, the way she clutched the white rose like a shield. When he spoke, his voice was a low, resonant baritone, a vibration that she felt in her bones. It was calm, yet it carried an undeniable authority that brooked no argument. "Your father," he began, his words measured, "was a man of great honor. A long time ago, when I was a young and foolish man, I found myself in a situation with no escape. A situation that should have ended my life." He paused, his eyes flicking for a moment toward the headstone, a flicker of something unreadable, respect, perhaps grief, passing through them. "Your father stepped in. He had no reason to. He risked everything for a stranger. He saved me." Juliana stared, her mind reeling. Saved him? Her father? The man who jumped at the sound of a car backfiring? It was like he was speaking about a different person. "But I don't understand. He never said anything. He was just a bookseller." A ghost of a smile, there and gone in an instant, touched the man's lips. "He was many things, your father. But on that day, he was my savior. I made a promise to him that day. A vow. That if anything ever happened to him, I would ensure his family was safe. That his kindness would be repaid. This," he said, gesturing subtly toward the kneeling men, "is a debt of honor. We are here to pay our respects to a great man." The world tilted on its axis. Everything she knew about her quiet, gentle life felt like a fragile lie. A debt of honor? Men in black suits kneeling like knights? It was a scene from a movie, not her life. The man, Dominic, reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. His movements were economical, precise. He pulled out a card. It wasn't white or cream. It was a matte, stark black, heavy and expensive between his gloved fingers. He held it out to her. Hesitantly, her own hand trembling, she reached for it. As her fingers brushed against his gloved ones, a jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. It was so sudden, so intense, that she gasped softly, her eyes flying back to his. His gaze darkened, the storm in his eyes intensifying, and she knew he had felt it too. That simple, accidental touch had sparked something alive and humming in the space between them. She looked down at the card. There were no names, no fancy logos. Just 10 embossed, silver digits, a phone number. "My name is Dominic," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming almost intimate. "If you are ever in trouble, if you are ever afraid, if you need anything at all, you call that number. It will always find me. No matter where you are. No matter the time. Do you understand?" His words weren't a suggestion. They were a vow, a shield being offered. Juliana could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She clutched the black card, its edges digging into her palm, a tangible piece of this terrifying, bewildering dream. Dominic gave one last long look, his eyes seeming to memorize every feature of her face, the curve of her cheek, the fear in her eyes, the parting of her lips. Then he turned. He walked back to the line of men, and with a motion so slight she almost missed it, they all rose as one. Without a backward glance, they moved, a silent, dark river flowing back down the path, their forms swallowed by the mist and the gathering dusk. In an instant they were gone. The cemetery was silent once more. But nothing was the same. Juliana stood alone, the white rose and the black card held in her hands, one a symbol of the gentle past she thought she knew, the other a dangerous key to a future she couldn't possibly imagine. The wind whispered through the barren trees, and for the first time, it didn't sound lonely. It sounded like a promise. A dangerous, thrilling, and terrifying promise. The black card became a secret weight in her life. Juliana had tucked it into the back of her wallet, behind a faded photo of her father. It felt like carrying a live wire, a dormant, dangerous power she was both terrified and comforted to possess. For weeks, life returned to its quiet rhythm, the memory of the graveyard and the man named Dominic fading into a surreal dream. But then the trouble started. Her landlord, Mr. Henderson, was a man whose smile never reached his eyes. He'd decided her cozy, rent-controlled apartment was worth triple its value, and he wanted her out. It began with thinly veiled threats slipped under her door, then escalated to loud, intimidating visits where he would pound on her door, his voice a venomous snarl. "You don't belong here anymore, sweetheart. Make this easy on yourself." One evening he went too far. He waited for her in the dimly lit hallway as she returned from work, blocking her path to her own door. The smell of stale cigars clung to him. "Last warning," he'd hissed, his face too close to hers. "I have new tenants who can pay. Be out by Friday, or things will get unpleasant." Trembling with a fear that was colder and sharper than any she'd felt in the cemetery, Juliana had fumbled with her keys, locked the door behind her, and slid to the floor, tears of frustration and terror finally falling. She was alone. The police had been useless, calling it a civil matter. She had no family left. The walls of her safe haven felt like they were closing in. And then her eyes fell on her wallet. With a shaking hand, she retrieved the matte black card. The embossed numbers felt like braille for a world she didn't understand. Was this trouble? Was this what he meant? Taking a deep, ragged breath, she dialed the number on her phone. It rang only once. A deep, calm voice answered, not with a hello, but with a simple, "Speak." "It's Juliana," she stammered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "From the cemetery. My father's grave. I think I'm in trouble." There was no hesitation. "Give me your address. Now." She gave it to him, her words tumbling out. The line went dead. For a moment, she wondered if she had made a catastrophic mistake. But within 45 minutes, a quiet, powerful knock resonated through her apartment, so different from Henderson's aggressive pounding. She opened the door, and there he was. Dominic filled the doorway. He wasn't wearing a suit this time, but dark, impeccably tailored trousers and a simple black sweater that stretched across his broad shoulders. He looked less like a specter from a funeral and more like a devastatingly handsome, yet equally dangerous, man. His stormy eyes scanned her face, taking in her red-rimmed eyes and pale complexion. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Where is he?" Dominic's voice was low, a controlled rumble. As if summoned by the question, Mr. Henderson's door across the hall creaked open. "I thought I told you," he began, his voice dripping with smug malice, but it died in his throat when he saw Dominic. Dominic didn't even turn his head fully. He simply shifted his gaze from Juliana to the landlord. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. He took 2 slow steps into the hallway, and the very air seemed to grow cold and still. "The lady is staying," Dominic said, his voice flat, absolute. "You will forget this building exists. You will forget her face. If her name so much as crosses your mind again, it will be the last thing you ever think of. Do you understand the words I am saying to you?" Mr. Henderson, a man who had seemed so large and threatening moments before, seemed to shrink. His face went ashen. He didn't argue. He didn't bluster. He just nodded, a quick, jerky movement of his head, his eyes wide with a primal fear Juliana had never seen before. "Good," Dominic said. He turned his back on the man as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture and walked back into Juliana's apartment, closing the door softly behind him. The entire confrontation had taken less than 30 seconds. The problem, she knew with utter certainty, was solved forever. The relief that washed over her was so profound her knees felt weak. "Thank you," she whispered, leaning against the doorframe. "I didn't know what else to do." "You did exactly what you should have," he said, his gaze softening as it rested on her. The terrifying man from the hallway was gone, replaced by the one who had spoken of honor at her father's grave. Overwhelmed with gratitude, the words tumbled out. "Let me make you dinner, please. It's the least I can do." He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing the offer against 1,000 unseen complications. Finally, he gave a single, slow nod. "I would like that." The evening that followed was a strange and beautiful dream. She cooked a simple pasta dish, and they sat at her small kitchen table. At first, the conversation was careful, a delicate dance around the edges of their lives. She told him about her father, the real one she remembered, the man who burned toast and loved bad science fiction movies. He listened, truly listened, his full attention a gift she hadn't realized she was starving for. Slowly, he began to offer pieces of himself. Not about his work, never that, but about his childhood in Sicily, his love for classic literature that rivaled her father's, his quiet respect for loyalty and family. She saw the man beneath the power, a man of depth and intelligence, a gentleman who held her chair and whose eyes never strayed from hers when she spoke. The safe, warm feeling she'd had at the cemetery returned, but this time it was stronger, blooming into something more. It was a magnetic pull, a thrilling current that flowed between them every time their hands nearly brushed reaching for the salt, every time his low laugh echoed in her small kitchen. Hours slipped away like minutes. Finally, he stood, the hour growing late. "I should go." She walked him to the door, her heart beginning its frantic rhythm again. The cozy intimacy of the dinner shattered, replaced by the electric tension of their first meeting. He stopped just before the door, turning to face her in the dim light of the hallway. He was so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the flecks of silver in his stormy gray eyes. The air crackled. It was a living thing, thick with unspoken words and a desire so potent it stole her breath. Her gaze dropped to his lips, and she felt a flush of heat spread through her. She thought he would kiss her. She wanted him to kiss her, more than she had ever wanted anything. But Dominic was a man who understood the power of a promise over the satisfaction of a moment. He lifted his hand, his fingers incredibly gentle as they tilted her chin up, forcing her eyes back to his. He searched her face, his expression a mixture of fierce protectiveness and a raw, aching tenderness that made her heart feel too large for her chest. He leaned in slowly, his intent clear. Juliana's eyes fluttered closed, her lips parting in anticipation. But the kiss never found her mouth. Instead, he pressed his lips to her forehead. It was not a chaste, brotherly kiss. It was slow, deliberate, a brand. His lips were warm and firm against her skin, and the sensation shot through her entire body, a bolt of pure, undiluted intimacy that left her dizzy. It was a claiming and a vow, a silent declaration that reverberated in the stillness between them. It felt more profound, more possessive, than any kiss on the lips could have been. He pulled back, his eyes dark and blazing with a contained fire. "Good night, Juliana," he murmured, his voice a rough caress. And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the silent apartment. She leaned back against the closed door, her fingers pressed to the spot on her forehead where his lips had been. The skin still tingled, humming with the memory of his touch. The problem with the landlord was solved, but in its place, Dominic had left a new, infinitely more dangerous problem, a longing that had taken root deep inside her, and a heart that was already undeniably his. The kiss on her forehead became a ghost that lived in Juliana's apartment. It lingered in the air, a constant, tantalizing promise that made the silence feel loud and the empty spaces feel full of potential. The black card was no longer a secret, It was a bridge, and across that bridge, Dominic began to walk into her life with a quiet, unwavering certainty. Their courtship was not like anyone else's. It was a series of intense, stolen moments that built a new world just for them. He would appear at her door in the evening, a single, perfect red rose in his hand, and take her to a tiny, hidden Italian restaurant where no menus were needed. They would talk for hours, the conversation flowing as easily as the rich, red wine. She learned about the weight of his responsibilities, the code of honor that was his compass, and the lonely path he had walked before her. He, in turn, learned about her quiet strength, her resilient spirit that had weathered grief, and the boundless capacity for love she carried within her. The magnetic pull between them became a force of nature they could no longer resist. One night, as he walked her to her door after a moonlit stroll, he stopped her beneath the soft glow of the porch light. "Juliana," he murmured, his voice rough with a feeling he could no longer contain. He didn't wait for an answer. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch both possessive and reverent, and finally his lips found hers. It was not a gentle first kiss. It was a conflagration. It was weeks of pent-up longing, of electric glances and tender promises, all exploding into one perfect, consuming moment. Her hands fisted in the soft wool of his coat, pulling him closer as he deepened the kiss, his tongue sweeping into her mouth with a claiming intensity that left her breathless and weak. It was passion, raw and untamed, but underneath it was a current of profound tenderness, a silent vow that this was more than just desire. This was a beginning. After that, their world shrank to include only each other. Long, passionate kisses became their language, and the safe circle of his arms became her home. He showed her a side of himself no one else saw, the man who could laugh freely, who could be playful, whose touch could be both fiercely protective and devastatingly gentle. In the privacy of her apartment, with the city lights twinkling outside her window, they explored the intoxicating intimacy growing between them. The world with its dangers and debts faded away, leaving only the sound of their shared breaths and the feeling of his skin against hers. It was a spicy, secret world they built together, a haven of steam and whispered promises. One crisp, clear night, he took her to the observatory, a place high above the city where the stars felt close enough to touch. The air was cold, and he stood behind her, his strong arms wrapped around her, his chin resting on her head as they looked out at the infinite tapestry of lights. "I need to tell you everything," he said, his voice a soft rumble against her back. "You deserve to know." He held her tighter, as if bracing himself. "Your father, he wasn't just a bookseller, Juliana. He was a legend. A man of immense respect and cunning. My family, we operate in a world of shadows. We have power, but it comes with enemies. When I was 22, I was ambushed by a rival family. I was cornered, outnumbered. It was over." Juliana held her breath, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Your father appeared from nowhere. He had no weapon. He used only his words, his reputation, his sheer force of will. He stood between me and certain death, and he negotiated for my life. He called in favors that cost him dearly. He saved me not with a gun, but with his honor. The debt I owe him is one I could never fully repay." The pieces finally clicked into place. The kneeling men, the instant respect, the fear in her landlord's eyes. It wasn't just about one man, it was about the shadow of a giant she had never known. Dominic turned her in his arms to face him, his hands sliding down to her waist. His eyes, reflecting the starlight, were deadly serious. "But what I feel for you," he said, his voice dropping to an intense, raw whisper, "has nothing to do with that debt. Nothing at all. Protecting you started as a duty, a vow I made to a man I respected. But loving you," he shook his head, a look of near wonder on his face. "Loving you is my choice. It is the one truly free thing I have ever done. It is my freedom, Juliana. You are my freedom." He released her then, and slowly, so slowly, he lowered himself to one knee on the cold stone. He took her left hand in his thumb stroking her skin. From his pocket he drew a small, black velvet box. When he opened it, Juliana's breath caught. Nestled inside was not a large, flashy diamond, but but a stunning, deep blue sapphire, surrounded by smaller diamonds that glittered like captured starlight. It was elegant, powerful, and uniquely them. "The sapphire," he said, his gaze locked on hers, "is for the color of the sky the night I realized I was falling in love with you. It is for the depth of what I feel for you, which is deeper than any ocean. Build a life with me. Be my wife. Let me spend forever not just protecting you, but loving you, cherishing you, waking up beside you every single day. Say you'll have me." Tears of pure, unadulterated happiness streamed down Juliana's face, catching the starlight. She wasn't seeing the powerful, feared man kneeling before her. She was only seeing Dominic, her protector, her confidant, the love of her life. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Then louder, with a joy that seemed to light up the night, "Yes." He slid the cool, beautiful ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. As he rose, he swept her into his arms, spinning her once in a circle before crushing her to his chest, his lips finding hers in a kiss that tasted of promises, of forever, of a love that had been born in the shadow of death but was destined to live forever in the light. She had gone to her father's grave mourning the loss of one great love, and had miraculously found another. In Dominic, she had found not just a shield from the world, but a partner for her soul. A powerful, lasting, and fiercely passionate love that had, against all odds, changed her life forever. This story of a debt of honor turning into a forever love proves that the most beautiful beginnings can come from the darkest places. If this tale of Juliana and Dominic captured your heart, then you won't want to miss the next story of passion and protection. Subscribe to the channel and let us know you're here. Where in the world are you watching from? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Did Dominic's confession under the stars win your heart? We read every single one.
Waitress pushed into pool, everyone laughed, then a billionaire steps in, left everyone stunned. What if one moment of cruelty could change everything? Grace wiped down the last table at the country club's poolside restaurant, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished stone. At 34, she'd been serving the wealthy members of Riverside Country Club for 3 years, invisible to most, except when they needed their drinks refilled. The summer heat still lingered even as evening approached, and the pool area buzzed with laughter from a private graduation party. Grace had learned to smile through anything. The condescending looks, the barely there tips, the way some guests spoke about her like she wasn't standing right there. But tonight felt different somehow, heavier, like the thick air before a storm. She tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear and balanced the tray of empty glasses, just wanting to finish her shift and get home to her 8-year-old daughter. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, her entire world would shift in ways she never could have imagined. Where are you watching from tonight? Grace had always been the kind of person who tried to see the good in everyone, even when they made it difficult. Tonight's party was for Charlotte Pemberton, a local judge's daughter who'd just graduated from law school. The poolside terrace sparkled with string lights, and expensive champagne flowed freely among the 20-something crowd. "Excuse me, waitress," called Charlotte from her spot by the pool's edge. Grace approached with a practiced smile, noting how the young woman's designer dress probably cost more than Grace made in 2 months. "We need more champagne, and make sure it's the good stuff this time." The dismissive tone stung, but Grace simply nodded. As she headed toward the bar, Grace overheard Charlotte talking to her friends. "Did you see her shoes? I can't believe they let the help dress like that. Daddy should really talk to management about standards." The group erupted in laughter, and Grace felt her cheeks burn. At the bar, Grace took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was here. Every shift brought her closer to saving enough for her daughter Lily's school supplies and maybe even a small birthday party next month. The bartender, Frank, noticed her expression. "Rough crowd tonight?" he asked gently. Grace managed a weak smile. "Nothing I can't handle." She loaded the champagne onto her tray and walked back toward the pool. When she approached their table, Charlotte was in the middle of a story about how her father had cleaned house at the courthouse. "Sometimes you just have to remind people where they belong," Charlotte said. Grace set down the champagne bottles carefully, but as she turned to leave, Charlotte's voice stopped her cold. "Actually, waitress, there's something spilled near my chair. Be a dear and clean it up, won't you? Grace looked down and saw nothing but clean stone, but she knelt anyway, pretending to wipe the area. The humiliation felt thick in her throat, but she needed this job. As Grace stood up, she noticed a man sitting alone at a corner table she hadn't seen before. He was perhaps 42, dressed simply in khakis and a button-down shirt, watching the scene with quiet intensity. Unlike the other guests, he didn't look away when their eyes met, instead offering a small, sympathetic smile. Charlotte's voice grew louder as she regaled her friends with another story. So I told the barista, "Do you know who my father is?" You should have seen how quickly she remade my latte. Charlotte stood up, swaying slightly from the champagne. Some people need to learn their place in this world. Grace tried to focus on her work, but when she passed by again, Charlotte suddenly grabbed her arm. Wait, I have an idea for some fun. It's so hot tonight, and you look absolutely exhausted. What do you say we help you cool off? Before Grace could respond, Charlotte's boyfriend Jake jumped up, grinning. Oh, this is perfect. Grace backed away, but she was surrounded now by 5 of Charlotte's friends. Please, I need to get back to work, Grace said quietly. Frank, the bartender, looked over with concern, but he was trapped behind the bar. The mysterious man in the corner had stopped eating and was now watching intently, his expression growing darker. Grace felt trapped as Charlotte and her friends closed in around her. Come on, don't be such a spoilsport, Charlotte said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. It's just a little fun. Besides, your uniform could probably use a wash anyway. The insult hit Grace like a physical blow. She thought about Lily at home, probably doing homework, trusting that mommy would come home with enough tip money for groceries tomorrow. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. The tension reached a breaking point as Charlotte nodded to Jake, and Grace realized with horror what was about to happen. She was just steps away from the pool's edge, with nowhere to run, as 20 people watched and waited. Jake lunged forward and shoved Grace hard in the chest. She stumbled backward, arms windmilling as she tried to catch her balance, but gravity won. Grace hit the chlorinated water with a splash that echoed across the terrace. The cold shock knocked the breath from her lungs as she sank beneath the surface. When she finally surfaced, gasping and sputtering, the sound that greeted her was worse than the cold water: laughter. Not just from Charlotte's group, but from other guests who had gathered to watch. Grace treaded water in her soaked uniform, mascara running down her cheeks, feeling more humiliated than she'd ever felt in her life. Oh my God, that was priceless, Charlotte squealed, pulling out her phone. This is definitely going on social media. The crowd laughed even harder, and Grace felt something break inside her chest. She looked around desperately for a ladder, but they were on the far side of the pool. Hey, while you're in there, maybe you can clean the pool too, someone called out, triggering another wave of cruel laughter. Grace's hands finally found the pool's edge, but her wet fingers slipped on the smooth stone as she tried to pull herself up. That's when she heard a voice cut through the laughter like a knife. That's enough. The tone was quiet but carried an authority that made every person fall silent. Grace looked up to see the man from the corner table, walking purposefully toward the pool, his face set in controlled fury. He knelt down and extended his hand. Let me help you. Something in his voice made Grace trust him instantly. She grasped his hand, and he pulled her up with surprising strength, steadying her as she stood dripping on the stone. Without a word, he shrugged off his shirt and wrapped it around her shoulders. Are you hurt? He asked softly, his eyes full of genuine concern. Grace shook her head, though she was trembling from cold and shock. Charlotte started to protest. Hey, we were just having some fun, but the man's gaze turned to her with such intensity that she actually took a step backward. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Grace wrapped the shirt tighter around herself, grateful for this unexpected kindness. But she could see in his eyes that this was far from over, and Charlotte seemed to sense it too, her cocky smile finally starting to fade. The man stepped forward, his voice carrying across the silent terrace. What I just witnessed was assault. You deliberately pushed this woman into a pool, and then you humiliated her while she was helpless. Charlotte tried to laugh it off, but it came out as a nervous giggle. It was just a joke. Everyone was having fun. Everyone. The man looked around at the crowd, many of whom were now staring at their phones or finding their drinks very interesting. This woman was working, trying to earn money to support her family, and you thought it would be amusing to assault her for entertainment. Charlotte's father, Judge Pemberton, appeared from the restaurant. What seems to be the trouble here? Charlotte immediately brightened, thinking her father would handle this stranger. Daddy, this man is making a big deal out of nothing. We were just playing around with the waitress. The mysterious man reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Judge Pemberton. As the judge read it, his face went completely white. He looked up at the man, then back at the card, then at his daughter with growing horror. Charlotte, do you have any idea who this is? Charlotte shrugged, still defiant. Some random guy who needs to mind his own business. But Judge Pemberton was already moving toward Grace, his hands shaking. Miss, I am so terribly sorry for what happened here tonight. The mysterious man spoke again, his voice still eerily calm. My name is Daniel Sterling. I own Sterling Industries, and as of last month, I also own this country club. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. Even Grace recognized that name. Sterling Industries was one of the largest companies in the state. Charlotte's face went from confident to confused to terrified in seconds. That's impossible, she stammered. You're dressed like... Daniel's smile was cold as winter. Like someone who judges people by their character instead of their bank account. He turned to Grace, his expression softening immediately. Ma'am, I'd like to offer you my sincere apology for what you've experienced here tonight. This behavior is not what this establishment represents, and there will be immediate consequences. Then he addressed the crowd. Anyone who participated in or encouraged what happened here tonight is banned from this property permanently. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. The stunned silence was broken only by security guards' footsteps as they approached. Grace stood there in Daniel's shirt, watching as the people who had laughed at her humiliation just minutes before now scrambled to distance themselves from Charlotte. Daniel turned back to Grace with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the authority he'd just displayed. Let's get you somewhere warm and dry, he said, guiding her toward the main building. I'm truly sorry you had to experience that. No one should ever be treated that way, especially not while working hard to make an honest living. In the manager's office, Grace changed into dry clothes. When she emerged, she found Daniel waiting with hot tea and a concerned expression. Are you feeling better? Grace nodded, though she was still processing everything. I don't understand why you helped me, she said quietly. You don't even know me. Daniel smiled, and for the first time that evening, it reached his eyes. My mother was a waitress when I was growing up. She worked 3 jobs to keep food on our table. I've never forgotten where I came from, or how hard some people have to work just to survive. He paused, looking out at the now empty pool area. People like Charlotte think money gives them the right to treat others as less than human. They're wrong. He turned back to Grace with a serious expression. I want to offer you a position at my company's headquarters. It's an administrative role with full benefits, paid time off, and a salary that's more than triple what you're making here. You'd also have opportunities for advancement. Grace's eyes filled with tears of overwhelming gratitude. But why? She whispered. You saw how I was treated tonight. Daniel shook his head firmly. What I saw was a woman who maintained her dignity and professionalism even when faced with cruelty. You didn't fight back, you didn't lose your temper, and you didn't let them break your spirit. Those are exactly the qualities I value. 3 months later, Grace sat in her new office overlooking the city, helping coordinate the company's charitable foundation. She'd been able to move Lily to a better school district, and for the first time in years, she wasn't worried about making rent. Sometimes she thought about that night at the pool, Not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Daniel had become not just her employer, but a friend and mentor who reminded her that kindness was a choice, and that true strength came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Charlotte had been arrested for assault, while Judge Pemberton had quietly stepped down from the bench. But perhaps the most beautiful part was what Grace had learned about herself, that she was worthy of respect, kindness, and opportunity, not because someone powerful decided to help her, but because she had always possessed those qualities within herself. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Sometimes the most extraordinary changes come from the simplest acts of human decency, and sometimes it takes a moment of darkness to help us truly appreciate the light.